Behind every picture-perfect love story lies the untold truth. And for Julia Trubkina and Brandon Gibbs, stars of 90 Day Fiancé, that truth was darker than anyone could have imagined. Today, we reveal the shocking downfall of Brandon Gibbs and the heartbreaking choice Julia was forced to make. Brandon Gibbs became entangled in nearly $200,000 of debt through online gambling platforms. Brandon Gibbs, his wife, kept pressuring Julia Trubkina to pay off his secret $200,000 debt. Later on, as Brandon Gibbs failed to repay the debt, a lawsuit was filed against him, and he was subsequently arrested. According to the court's verdict, Brandon Gibbs has been sentenced to 1 year in prison. With this truth exposed, the situation turned even more tragic. Under constant mental pressure and facing numerous problems, Julia Trubkina eventually had no choice but to divorce Brandon Gibbs. Lastly, Julia Trubkina divorced his husband Brandon Gibbs. Later, to start a new life, she decided to marry a man named Zach. Let's start from the beginning. Julia Trubkina entered the lives of 90 Day Fiancé viewers as a vibrant, passionate, and determined woman from Russia. She was fiery, outspoken, and unafraid to stand her ground. When she met Brandon Gibbs, a soft-spoken man from Virginia, the two seemed like complete opposites. Yet, as often happens in reality TV romances, opposites attracted. Brandon, who grew up on his parents' farm, represented stability and tradition. Julia, on the other hand, embodied adventure and independence. Their relationship became one of the central arcs of the 90 Day Fiancé franchise, filled with cultural clashes, parental interference, and the raw emotions of two people trying to build a future together in America. At first, fans were skeptical. Could Julia adapt to farm life? Could Brandon stand up to his controlling parents, Betty and Ron Gibbs? But episode after episode, viewers saw genuine love. Julia teased Brandon about his shyness, while Brandon adored Julia's fiery personality. They argued, reconciled, laughed, and dreamed together. When the cameras rolled, it all seemed picture perfect. They married, shared cute social media posts, and even discussed starting a family one day. But what no one knew, not the fans, not even Julia herself, was that Brandon was hiding a dangerous secret, a secret that would eventually destroy the foundation of their marriage. Because behind closed doors, Brandon had a growing obsession: online gambling. At first glance, Brandon Gibbs looked like the last man you'd expect to spiral into gambling. He was quiet, polite, and grew up on a small farm in Dinwiddie County, Virginia, fixing fences, feeding animals, and helping his parents. On TV, fans saw a man overshadowed by Julia's fiery personality and his mother's control. But deep down, Brandon carried a restlessness no one saw. One night, while Julia scrolled through Instagram, Brandon stumbled upon an ad, "Win big from home." Out of curiosity, he placed a $50 bet. When it turned into $120, his heart raced. For the first time, Brandon felt powerful, like he could provide more, maybe even move Julia and himself away from the farm. He didn't tell her, of course. Julia hated gambling. To him, it was just harmless fun. The fun quickly became an obsession. Online casinos offered flashing slot machines, live poker, and endless sports bets. Brandon stayed up late after Julia went to bed, chasing the thrill of his first win. Sometimes he earned hundreds in a night. Other times he lost everything. But each loss only fueled his belief that one more bet could turn it all around. Soon, Brandon was gambling with more than savings. Credit cards maxed out. Payday loans stacked up. $5,000 in debt grew to $20,000, then $50,000, until it exploded into nearly $200,000. Brandon lived in constant panic, hiding letters marked "Final Notice" and deleting angry emails from creditors. Julia noticed the change. Brandon was moody, distracted, and secretive. Their bank accounts showed strange withdrawals. When she confronted him, he brushed it off with excuses about farm expenses or bills. Julia wanted to believe him. She had given up everything to be with him. But the cracks in his lies grew wider. The truth came crashing down one afternoon when Julia opened the mailbox. Inside was a thick envelope stamped in red. Notice of default. The papers revealed the shocking number, $200,000 in unpaid debt. That evening, Julia spread the documents across the kitchen table. "Brandon," she said, her voice breaking, "what is this? What have you done to us?" For the first time, Brandon had no excuses left. His secret life had finally been exposed. The kitchen was silent, except for the crinkling of the papers Julia held in her hands. Brandon stood frozen at the doorway, his eyes darting between his wife's tear-streaked face and the stack of debt notices spread across the table. For a moment, he considered lying again, but the evidence was right there. There was no escape. Julia's voice broke the silence. $200,000, Brandon? 200,000? Her words were sharp, filled with disbelief. The Julia the world knew from 90 Day Fiancé, fiery, passionate, unafraid to say exactly what was on her mind, was in full force. But this wasn't playful banter or television drama. This was betrayal. Brandon lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. "Julia, I didn't mean for it to get this bad. I thought I could fix it before you found out." Julia slammed the papers onto the table. "Fix it? You ruined us. Do you have any idea what this means? This isn't just your problem, Brandon. This is our life, our marriage. How could you keep this from me?" Julia felt as though the floor had been ripped out from beneath her. She had given up everything, her country, her family, her independence, to be with Brandon. She had trusted him to build a future together. And now she realized the man she had married was drowning in secrets. Her mind raced with questions. Where did the money go? How could he gamble so much without telling me? What else is he hiding? The betrayal wasn't just about money. It was about trust. Julia's hands shook as she pointed at the letters. "Do you understand what you've done? They're going to take everything. They're going to ruin us. Brandon, how could you let this happen?" Brandon's words stumbled out, desperate, fragile. "It started small, Julia. Just a little bit here and there. I thought I could win, that I could make things better for us. I wanted to give you more. A house. A better life. I thought if I could just hit it big, we wouldn't have to worry." Julia's laugh was bitter, almost a sob. "A better life? You've destroyed the life we had. Do you think I care about money like this? Do you think I wanted you to gamble behind my back?" He reached out, but Julia pulled away, her eyes blazing. "Don't touch me. Don't you dare touch me." The days that followed were chaos. Julia couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the debt notices, the lies, the betrayal. She replayed every conversation they'd ever had, wondering how she hadn't noticed sooner. Brandon tried to comfort her, but Julia was inconsolable. Their home, once filled with laughter and teasing arguments, now echoed with silence and anger. Phone calls came at all hours, creditors demanding payment, threatening legal action. Julia felt humiliated, trapped in a nightmare she hadn't chosen. She began to lash out, her words sharp and unforgiving. "You've ruined us, Brandon. Do you understand? You've ruined everything." Brandon, drowning in guilt, grew more desperate. He begged Julia to stand by him, to help him find a way out. But the more he pleaded, the more she felt suffocated. It didn't take long for the financial mess to spiral into something bigger. Brandon had missed too many payments, defaulted on too many loans. A lawsuit was filed against him by one of the online gambling creditors. The official notice arrived one morning, sealed in an envelope that felt heavier than the world itself. Brandon opened it in silence, his face pale as he read the words. Julia snatched the paper from his hands and scanned it herself. Her heart dropped. "This is it," she whispered. "This is real. They're taking you to court." Brandon collapsed into a chair, his face buried in his hands. He had tried to deny it for so long, to pretend it wasn't happening, but now the reality was unavoidable. That night, Julia sat across from Brandon, her voice trembling but firm. "I don't know if I can do this anymore. I can't live like this, Brandon. I didn't come here to watch my life fall apart." Brandon's eyes filled with tears. "Julia, please, don't leave me. I need you. I'll fix this, I promise. Just give me a chance. But Julia shook her head. You had your chances. You had so many. And every time, you chose to lie. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this. The weight of Brandon's secret was now fully out in the open, and with it came a storm that Julia Trubkina could not have prepared for. The bright, outspoken woman who once laughed on 90 Day Fiancé found herself staring at a future clouded by shame, betrayal, and financial ruin. Julia lay awake night after night, staring at the ceiling in the darkness. Her mind refused to rest. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the numbers. $200,000. A mountain of debt so high it felt impossible to climb. She thought about the sacrifices she had made, leaving her family in Russia, giving up her independence, adjusting to life in America. She had taken risks for love, believing in Brandon's promises of a stable, happy life. Now, all of that seemed like a cruel joke. Beside her, Brandon would toss and turn, whispering apologies that Julia no longer had the strength to answer. The silence between them grew louder than any argument they'd ever had. The creditors didn't stop. Day and night, the phone rang with unfamiliar numbers. Julia began to dread the sound of it. Sometimes, she picked up only to hear harsh voices demanding repayment. Other times, Brandon would rush to answer, leaving the room to hide his humiliation. But there was no hiding anymore. Every letter that arrived, every notice taped to their door, was a reminder of how far they had fallen. Julia felt trapped, forced to face not only the financial consequences, but also the public shame. They were reality TV stars after all. Fans online followed their every move. How long before someone found out? How long before the tabloids splashed their dirty secret across the headlines? Julia had always been strong-willed, but this situation tested her like never before. She tried, at first, to be supportive. She told herself that marriage meant standing by each other in hard times. But the resentment grew like a thorn in her chest. Each time she looked at Brandon, she didn't see the man she married. She saw the lies. She saw the weakness that had brought them here. You didn't just ruin your life, Brandon, she snapped one evening. You ruined mine. Do you even care what this has done to me? Brandon, his face pale and sunken from stress, could only whisper, I'm sorry, Julia. I never wanted this for us. But his apologies, repeated endlessly, began to feel empty. As the lawsuit moved forward, Julia was dragged deeper into the nightmare. Court dates were set. Lawyers became involved. Every document, every form, every meeting was a reminder of the chaos Brandon had created. Julia sat beside Brandon in the lawyer's office, her arms crossed, her jaw tight. She listened as they discussed repayment plans, settlements, and the possibility of prison time. At one point, the lawyer looked directly at Julia. If the debt cannot be repaid, Brandon faces serious legal consequences. Mrs. Gibbs, this will affect you too. Your joint assets, your accounts, your future. Julia's heart sank. My future, she thought bitterly. What future? The emotional pressure became unbearable. Julia found herself snapping at friends, isolating from family, and even avoiding social media. She couldn't stand the thought of pretending everything was fine when her world was falling apart. At home, arguments with Brandon became routine. She demanded answers he couldn't give. She demanded solutions he didn't have. Do something, she screamed one night, slamming her fist on the table. Find a way out of this. Don't just sit there waiting for everything to collapse. But Brandon had no answers. His once quiet, easygoing nature had now turned into paralyzing despair. He barely spoke. He barely ate. And Julia began to wonder if she was fighting a battle she could never win. One evening, after another exhausting day of phone calls and paperwork, Julia sat alone on the couch. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered to herself, "This isn't what I wanted. This isn't the life I dreamed of." For the first time, she allowed herself to consider the unthinkable. Maybe I can't stay. Maybe this marriage is already over. She looked at Brandon, slumped in a chair across the room, his eyes hollow, his spirit broken. And in that moment, Julia realized something painful. She no longer saw him as her partner. She saw him as her burden. The day of the court hearing arrived like a storm Julia could not escape. For weeks, she had dreaded this moment, the culmination of Brandon's secret life unraveling in front of strangers in a courtroom. The man who once promised her stability and love was now facing the harsh reality of his actions and dragging her down with him. The courthouse was cold and intimidating. Julia walked beside Brandon, her steps heavy, her face pale with exhaustion. She wore a plain black dress, not for style, but for survival, blending into the background, avoiding attention. Brandon looked even worse, his shoulders slumped, his eyes shadowed by sleepless nights, his suit hanging awkwardly on his thin frame. As they entered, Julia could feel eyes on them. Whispers followed. Some recognized them from 90 Day Fiancé. Others simply saw another man in trouble with his wife by his side. Either way, Julia wanted to disappear. Inside, the legal process unfolded with chilling formality. Lawyers spoke in clipped tones, presenting documents, outlining debts, and emphasizing Brandon's failure to meet obligations. Each figure mentioned, $10,000 here, $50,000 there, was another dagger in Julia's heart. The prosecution painted Brandon as reckless and irresponsible. They presented records of late payments, screenshots of gambling platforms, and transaction histories showing thousands of dollars lost in a matter of minutes. Your Honor, the prosecutor said firmly, this is not simply a case of financial mismanagement. This is a pattern of addictive behavior, of dishonesty, and of total disregard for the responsibilities of a husband and a citizen. Julia lowered her gaze, humiliated. Every word felt like a public shaming, not just of Brandon, but of herself for being tied to him. Brandon's lawyer tried to soften the picture. He spoke of a man overwhelmed by pressure, caught in the seductive trap of online gambling. He emphasized Brandon's previously clean record, his history of hard work on his family's farm, and his deep regret for his actions. Brandon himself stood and addressed the court, his voice shaking. I made mistakes. I thought I could fix them, but I only made things worse. I never meant to hurt Julia or anyone. I take full responsibility. Julia, watching him, felt torn. Part of her pitied the broken man in front of her, but another part, a stronger part, felt cold and numb. She had heard these apologies too many times before. After hours of arguments and evidence, the judge finally delivered the decision. Mr. Gibbs, the court finds that you have repeatedly failed to meet your financial obligations. Your gambling debts, your dishonesty, and your inability to resolve these matters have left no alternative. You are hereby sentenced to 1 year in prison. The words echoed through the courtroom. Brandon's face went pale, his mouth slightly open as though he couldn't breathe. Julia's hands trembled, but she didn't reach for him, not this time. The gavel struck, and just like that, their world collapsed. Brandon was escorted away in handcuffs. Julia watched in stunned silence as her husband, the man she once danced with, laughed with, dreamed with, was led out like a criminal. His eyes searched for hers, desperate, pleading. But Julia couldn't bring herself to look back. She stood alone in the courtroom, surrounded by strangers, her heart heavy with anger and grief. The days that followed were some of the darkest Julia had ever known. News of Brandon's sentencing spread quickly online. Fans of 90 Day Fiancé speculated, blogs reported, and social media filled with comments. Some pitied her, others mocked her. Julia tried to ignore it, but the humiliation cut deep. She felt like the world was laughing at her pain. She wanted to scream at them, to tell them they didn't know the full story, but deep down, she knew she had lost control of her own narrative. She visited Brandon once in prison during those early weeks. He looked smaller behind the glass, his hands clutching the phone, his eyes desperate. Julia, please, he begged. Don't give up on me. I'll change. I'll be better. Just wait for me. Julia stared at him, her heart torn in two. But when she spoke, her words were flat, lifeless. I don't know if I can, Brandon. I don't know if I want to. And with that, she walked away, leaving him to face the consequences of his choices alone. When the prison doors closed behind Brandon Gibbs, Julia Trubkina's life changed forever. For the first time since arriving in America, she felt completely alone. The cameras of 90 Day Fiancé were gone. The excitement of their whirlwind romance had faded, and what remained was a hollow silence that filled every corner of her life. The house they once shared felt different now. Brandon's absence was everywhere. The empty chair at the kitchen table, the silence in the evenings where his nervous laugh once filled the air. Julia would walk past his belongings, the shirts he left behind, the pictures of their wedding tucked into dusty frames, and feel a wave of anger, sadness, and nostalgia all at once. At night, she sometimes caught herself reaching across the bed instinctively, only to find cold sheets where Brandon used to lie. But instead of comfort, the thought of him only reminded her of betrayal. Brandon tried to stay connected. From prison, he called Julia whenever he could. The collect calls came at odd hours, the robotic voice always announcing before his voice broke through. "This is a call from an inmate at Julia," he would say, his voice heavy with regret. "I'm sorry. I think about you every day. Please don't give up on me. I'll change when I get out. I'll be better." At first, Julia answered. She listened. Sometimes she cried. Other times she sat in silence while Brandon poured out apologies and promises. But over time, she began to dread the calls. His words felt like chains dragging her back into a life she no longer wanted. She started letting the phone ring, ignoring his desperate attempts to cling to her. With Brandon gone, Julia faced the world alone. Friends she thought she could count on slowly drifted away, some not knowing what to say, others judging her for staying as long as she had. Even fans of the show turned against her online. Some comments mocked her. She should have known better marrying Brandon. Others pitied her. Poor Julia, she gave up everything for him. But none of them knew the real pain. Julia felt trapped between humiliation and freedom, free from Brandon's lies, but burdened with the shadow of his mistakes. Julia tried to rebuild her life. She took on more work, tried to distract herself with hobbies, and even considered moving away from the small town that reminded her of everything she lost. But it wasn't easy. Financially, she was still tied to Brandon's mess. Emotionally, she carried scars that wouldn't fade. Each time she tried to focus on herself, the past pulled her back. Even mundane things became heavy. Grocery shopping alone, paying bills by herself, walking past couples holding hands. All of it reminded her of what she thought she had and how quickly it had crumbled. One evening, Julia sat on the couch staring at the wall, the silence pressing in on her. She thought about the years she had spent with Brandon, the sacrifices, the love, the fights, the dreams. And for the first time, she admitted to herself, "I don't love him anymore." The realization was like a weight lifted and a knife to the heart at the same time. She felt relief, but also grief for the woman she used to be, the one who believed in fairy tales and happy endings. Brandon, meanwhile, wrote to her constantly. Letters filled with apologies, confessions, and desperate pleas. "I know I failed you," one letter read. "I know I ruined everything. But please don't give up on me. I need you when I get out. You're all I have left." Julia read them, sometimes crying, sometimes laughing bitterly. She kept them in a drawer, unable to throw them away, but unwilling to let them soften her heart. Each letter only confirmed what she already knew. Brandon was a chapter of her life that had ended. The year that Brandon spent behind bars felt like an eternity for Julia. Each passing day was a test of her strength, her patience, and her ability to survive in a country that often felt more foreign than ever. But as the months went by, Julia's heart hardened. The love she once had for Brandon was replaced by resentment, exhaustion, and the heavy truth she could no longer ignore. She needed to let go. Julia's breaking point came one afternoon in early spring. She had just returned home from work when the phone rang. Another collect call from Brandon. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Julia." Brandon's voice crackled through the line, filled with urgency. "I've been thinking about us, about when I get out. We can start fresh, you and me. I promise, no more lies, no more gambling. We can move forward. Just give me one more chance." Julia clenched the phone, her chest tight. For months, she had listened to these promises, over and over, but nothing changed. His words felt like a broken record, rehearsed and empty. "No, Brandon," she finally said, her voice shaking but firm. "There are no more chances. You destroyed everything. I can't do this anymore." There was silence on the other end, then a desperate plea. "Julia, please, don't say that. Don't give up on me. You're all I have." But Julia had already made her decision. For the first time, she hung up on him. That night, Julia sat at the kitchen table with a blank divorce petition in front of her. The papers looked simple, almost too simple for what they represented. The end of her marriage, the cutting of ties to the man she once believed was her soulmate. She hesitated, her pen hovering above the page. Memories flooded her mind. Their first kiss, their wedding vows, the playful moments fans had adored on 90 Day Fiancé. But then came the darker memories, the lies, the debts, the humiliation, the endless pain. With trembling hands, she began to write her name, and with each stroke of the pen, Julia felt the weight of her decision. Filing the paperwork was one of the hardest things Julia had ever done. She walked into the courthouse alone, her steps echoing in the hallway. At the clerk's desk, she handed over the documents, her heart pounding in her chest. The clerk stabbed the papers, and in that moment, Julia realized there was no turning back. She was no longer Julia Gibbs. She was Julia Trubkina again. As she walked out of the courthouse, a cold wind brushed against her face. But instead of sadness, she felt something unexpected: relief. When Brandon eventually learned about the divorce, his reaction was explosive. He called Julia from prison, his voice filled with anger and desperation. "You divorced me. After everything we've been through, how could you just walk away?" he shouted. Julia's voice was calm, steady. "I didn't walk away, Brandon. You pushed me away. Every lie, every dollar you gambled, every time you begged and promised and failed, that was you choosing this, not me." For once, Brandon had no reply. The line went silent. The divorce finalized a few months later. Julia didn't throw a party, didn't celebrate. Instead, she spent the day quietly reflecting on everything she had endured. She felt a mix of grief and freedom. Grief for the love that had died, freedom for the life that was now hers to rebuild. She packed away the last reminders of Brandon, old photos, his clothes, the letters from prison. One by one, she placed them in a box, sealed it shut, and carried it to the back of the closet where it would gather dust. For the first time in years, Julia allowed herself to imagine a future without Brandon. And though it was uncertain, it was hers. When the divorce was finalized, Julia Trubkina found herself at a crossroads. For years, she had been defined by her marriage to Brandon Gibbs, first as his fiancé, then as his wife, and finally as the woman who bore the brunt of his darkest secrets. But now, for the first time in a long time, Julia was free. Free to make choices for herself. Free to rediscover the woman she was before Brandon's lies consumed her life. At first, the silence was overwhelming. No phone calls from prison. No letters begging for forgiveness. No constant weight of debt pressing down on her shoulders. For weeks, Julia struggled to adjust to her new reality. She woke up some mornings unsure of what to do, where to go, who she even was without the chaos. But little by little, she began to rebuild. She returned to dance, something she had loved back in Russia, but had abandoned when her life with Brandon grew too heavy. She joined a local studio, surrounded by music and movement, and felt her body come alive again. The rhythm reminded her that she was still young, still vibrant, still capable of joy. Julia also threw herself into work. She began exploring opportunities outside of reality TV, determined to prove she was more than just a 90-day fiancé personality. She modeled, collaborated with brands, and even spoke out about her experiences. In interviews, she was honest but dignified. "Life doesn't always turn out the way you plan," she told one magazine. "But every ending is also a beginning. I've learned that you can lose everything and still find yourself again." Her words resonated with many, especially women who had faced betrayal or financial hardship. For the first time, Julia wasn't just surviving, she was inspiring others. With Brandon gone, Julia found space to breathe. She traveled more, exploring new cities, meeting new people, and reconnecting with parts of herself she had buried during her marriage. She spent time outdoors, hiking, taking long walks in the park, sitting by rivers where she could think in peace. She journaled, writing down her thoughts and fears, her hopes and dreams. "I am not just Brandon's ex-wife," she wrote one night. "I am Julia. I am strong. I am free." Of course, rebuilding wasn't easy. There were days when loneliness hit her hard, when she wished she had someone to lean on. There were nights when she replayed old memories and questioned if she had made the right decision. Financially, she was still climbing out of the mess Brandon had left behind. Bills needed to be paid, opportunities weren't always steady, and the stress sometimes felt unbearable. But unlike before, Julia no longer felt powerless. She was fighting for herself now, and that made all the difference. As months passed, Julia noticed something else happening. Her heart was slowly healing. The anger that once consumed her began to fade. She no longer woke up thinking about Brandon, no longer felt defined by his mistakes. And with that healing came the quiet possibility of love. Julia wasn't rushing into anything, but she began to open herself up again, to friendship, to connection, to the idea that not all men would betray her. One evening, while attending a mutual friends gathering, she met someone who would change everything, a man named Zach. He wasn't flashy, he didn't make grand promises, but his presence was steady, grounded, and kind. When Julia laughed at one of his jokes, she realized it was the first genuine laugh she'd had in months. It was small, but it was the beginning of something new. Julia had promised herself she would never fall into love too quickly again. After everything she endured with Brandon, the lies, the debt, the humiliation, she built walls around her heart. But life has a way of surprising people when they least expect it. And that surprise came in the form of Zach. They met casually, at a small gathering hosted by a mutual friend. Julia hadn't wanted to go. She almost stayed home, still weighed down by the scars of her past. But something inside told her she needed a change, a reminder that life existed beyond her pain. When she walked into the cozy living room filled with laughter and chatter, Zach noticed her immediately. He wasn't starstruck by her 90-day fiancé fame. He didn't approach her with assumptions or judgments. Instead, he simply smiled, introduced himself, and asked how she was enjoying the evening. It was ordinary, simple, yet for Julia, it felt extraordinary. Unlike Brandon, who was timid and often indecisive, Zach radiated confidence without arrogance. He had a calm energy, the kind that made people feel safe. He didn't rush to impress Julia, didn't flood her with promises. Instead, he listened. They talked about travel, about music, about their dreams. Julia laughed, genuinely laughed, for the first time in months. As the night wore on, Julia realized something unsettling. She was comfortable. Too comfortable. A part of her wanted to pull back, to remind herself not to trust too easily. But another part whispered, maybe this is what healing looks like. Zach asked Julia out a week later. Nothing fancy, just coffee at a quiet cafe downtown. Julia almost said no, afraid of what it might mean. But curiosity won. That first date stretched for hours. They spoke openly about their pasts. Julia, cautiously at first, sharing bits of her painful marriage. Zach, revealing his own struggles and mistakes. He didn't flinch when she mentioned Brandon's prison sentence. He didn't pity her. He simply nodded and said, "You've been through hell, but you're still standing. That tells me everything I need to know about you." Those words lingered in Julia's mind long after she went home. Over the next few months, Zach became a steady presence in Julia's life. He didn't pressure her. He didn't push for more than she was ready to give. Instead, he showed up in small ways, walking her home after dinner, calling to check in after a long day, surprising her with flowers just because. Julia found herself smiling again, feeling lighter. The shadows of Brandon's betrayal began to fade. Where once she felt like a victim, now she felt like a woman rediscovering her worth. One evening, they sat together under the stars after a long day. Julia, her guard still partly raised, turned to Zach and asked, "Why me? After everything I've been through, why would you choose me?" Zach looked at her, his eyes steady. Because you're real. You're strong. You've been broken, but you're not bitter. That's rare. And I don't care about your past. I care about the woman sitting in front of me right now. Julia's heart softened. For the first time since leaving Brandon, she felt something she thought she had lost forever: hope. Their relationship blossomed naturally. Julia didn't rush, but with each passing day, she allowed herself to trust Zach more. And Zach proved, again and again, that he was worthy of that trust. He celebrated her victories. He held her when she cried. He reminded her that she was more than the pain she had endured. And slowly, Julia realized she wasn't just moving on. She was falling in love. Julia never imagined she would stand at the altar a second time. After her divorce from Brandon Gibbs, she had convinced herself that marriage was a dream she could no longer trust. But love, as life often shows, has its own timing. And in Zach, Julia found not just a partner, but a new beginning. It wasn't extravagant. There were no grand cameras, no scripted reality TV moments, no crowd of strangers watching. Zach knew Julia had had enough of public scrutiny. So, one evening after a simple dinner, he led her to a quiet park where lanterns glowed softly among the trees. As they walked, Zach stopped, took her hands, and looked into her eyes. "Julia," he said, his voice calm but steady, "I know your heart has been through pain. I know trust hasn't come easy for you. But I also know I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you that love doesn't have to hurt. Will you marry me?" Julia's eyes filled with tears. For a moment, she saw flashes of her past. The wedding dress with Brandon, the broken promises, the courtroom. But then she looked at Zach, at the man who had stood by her, healed her, never judged her. And she smiled through her tears. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Their wedding was everything Julia had wanted the first time, but never truly had. It was small, intimate, filled only with people who truly cared about them. There were no TV crews, no producers dictating how they should pose, no strangers waiting to gossip about their marriage. Julia wore a simple but elegant gown. Zach, in a classic suit, couldn't take his eyes off her. As they exchanged vows, Julia's voice shook, but not from fear, from gratitude. "I once thought love was meant to break me," she said softly. "But you've shown me it can heal. Today, I choose you, Zach. Not because I need saving, but because with you, I finally feel free." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. After the wedding, Julia and Zach began building their new life. They moved into a modest apartment in the city, far from the farm life and chaos of Brandon's world. Their home wasn't extravagant, but it was filled with warmth. Plants in the windowsill, photos from their travels, the sound of laughter echoing in the evenings. For the first time, Julia felt she had a partner who truly shared the weight of life with her. Zach supported her dreams, encouraged her career, and celebrated every step she took toward independence. What struck Julia most about her marriage to Zach was how different it felt from before. With Brandon, she had often felt like she was carrying the burden of their relationship, always fighting, always pushing, always compensating for what he lacked. With Zach, it was different. There were still challenges, of course. Life was never perfect. But instead of lies and secrecy, there was honesty. Instead of fear, there was safety. Instead of humiliation, there was respect. Julia once wrote in her journal, "Love isn't about grand gestures or fairy tales. It's about peace. And for the first time, I have peace." Though her past still lingered in shadows, Julia no longer let it define her. Brandon was a chapter she had closed. The lessons she learned from that pain made her stronger, wiser, and ready for the future she was now living. And as she stood one evening on her balcony with Zach beside her, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Julia whispered to herself, "This is my second chance, my real beginning." More update. Brandon Gibbs is facing backlash after pressuring his wife, Julia Trubkina, to undergo surgery. In the middle of the tension, Brandon's father, Ron, stepped in to defend Julia, even telling his wife, Betty, to shut up. Meanwhile, Julia finally reached her breaking point. She clashed with Brandon's mother during a heated face-off over the couple's wedding plans, leaving emotions running high. Amid all the drama, there's also exciting news. Julia Trubkina is pregnant and expecting her first child with her husband, Brandon Gibbs. I will explain everything. 90-day fiancé. Brandon Gibbs slammed for pushing wife Julia for surgery. Once again, Brandon Gibbs is in the news, but this time it's for the wrong reasons. His unexpected push for Julia Trubkina to do something she wasn't ready for stunned everyone. During one of her epic rants, the 90-day fiancé star accused her of overselling it to her relatives. Season 9 is jam-packed with activities for the reality TV stars. Brandon and Julia recommitted to starting over together. The two of them wanted to put the past in the past and go on with their lives. On the subject of babies, though, the TLC stars can't seem to agree. On the show, Julia discovered a way to fix her infertility. However, surgery was necessary to resolve the matter. So, the Russian woman and her husband choose not to start a family. When was Brandon last? In reality, what transpired? Couples therapy helped Brandon and Julia work through their marital problems. The ex-husband failed to grasp why his wife was unable to start a family at that time. Upon learning of her infertility, he stood by her side. An after-resort second opinion was something the 90-day fiancé star hoped his bride would seek. After recommitting herself to her husband, Julia decided to get a second opinion. However, she was reluctant to return to the doctor and endure the same ordeal. The native Russian was pushed by Betty, Ron, and Brandon to seek a second opinion and keep her word. But seeing the joy on her husband's face made Julia anxious. If they were unable to have children, she was afraid he would be devastated. After discovering a way to fix their infertility, the husband of the TLC celebrity was overjoyed to finally start a family with his wife. After renewing their vows, Brandon Gibbs and Julia Trubkina were eager to spend some joyous time together. In honor of the occasion, they dined with their families. When Brandon broached the subject of having a baby at dinner, things took a surprising turn. After Julia had surgery, he told his parents and in-laws that she might have a family. Julia made it clear from away that she was opposed to undergoing surgery to remove the polyp. There was plenty of time, in her opinion, and they definitely won't have children. The decision of the 90-day fiancé star clearly crushed Brandon's heart. But his Reddit followers were furious that he made his wife get the operation done anyhow. Someone took to Reddit to criticize him and Betty, saying they don't show any empathy. In their treatment of Julia regarding the pregnancy, the LP stated Brandon and Betty need to be extremely ashamed of themselves. While discussing her concerns about the anesthesia, Brandon advised his wife not to oversell the surgery. The fans are already aware that the surgeries requiring anesthesia are not small potatoes. During the conversation, they saw the American native and his mother as being self-centered. Regarding what should be personal discussions between himself and Julia, one admirer stated, Brandon is completely insensitive. Gibbs should not have told his parents everything, according to many fans. No one seemed to care that he and Betty didn't try to comprehend Julia's anxieties. Instead, they pushed her. The overselling comment really made my blood boil, another person said. Brandon's dad Ron takes a stand for Julia, tells Betty to shut up. Brandon's dad, Ron, who stars on 90-Day Fiancé, is making waves on AHA for his courageous actions. He merely carried out the wishes of his viewers for his son. Someone mustered the guts to reprimand Betty, marking a first in recorded history. The show has significant decision-making for Brandon and Julia. A new beginning was formed as the couple, in front of their relatives, repeated their vows. But the reality TV pair has a hard time deciding if they want a family. The doctors gave Brandon and Julia a second opinion. The former was overjoyed to hear that his wife's health problems had a cure. That they may still try to start a family brought him joy, he thought. Julia is terrified of upsetting her husband's fantasy once more. Nobody should force her to have a family just yet. Tell me what Ron said. What were the reactions of the fans? The star of 90-Day Fiancé, it was never easy for Julia to fit in with Brandon's family. Her MIL was always too domineering and intrusive, which she hated. After marrying, the reality TV star uprooted their lives and settled into a new house. It took Julia 3 years to get back to the United States to see her family. The arrival of her parents in the country made her quite emotional, but Betty's attempts to welcome them to her property irritated the reality TV star. Upon her mother-in-law's attempt to inquire about her fertility test, Trubkina expressed her annoyance. When her in-laws again invaded her private, she lost her composure. Without informing Brandon and Julia beforehand, Betty and Ron staged a surprise party at their house. Betty needs to give Julia some space since she has made her need for it quite obvious. Many people thought Brandon's parents, Ron and Betty, were too nosy. Because of her controlling and poisonous personality, the latter is one of the most beloved TLC celebs. At a picturesque venue, Brandon and Julia recently repeated their wedding vows. In honor of their marriage, they took their families out to dinner. As they told their relatives about their joy, Brandon and Julia were overcome with emotion. To be sure, Gibbs brought up the subject of babies once more. He disclosed that the physicians had recommended surgery as a possible solution to her infertility. Julia made an effort to convey her anxiety about undergoing the treatment while under anesthesia. Additionally, she stated that they had decided against having a family. According to the 90-Day Fiancé star, there is plenty of time for her and Brandon to decide. The news startled Betty and Ron. Not wanting to waste any more time, the former abruptly cut in to mention that her daughter-in-law's biological clock is ticking. Julia should take a deep breath, Ron thought, and he understood her worries. He further advised his wife to avoid pressuring her and to allow the couple to make their own decision. Betty, as usual, was constantly interjecting. "Shut up," was Ron's last word as he took a stand with his daughter-in-law. The TLC diva won over Reddit users with her courageous defense of Julia. "It was so unexpected, but perfect that you told Betty to shut up," one fan said. "It was great to see Betty reflected in a mirror," according to another. "At last, someone advised her to," another person commented. "She should not be concerned about this." Julia finally loses it due to Brandon's mom both face off over wedding plans. Julia Trubkina, star of 90 Days, held firm during a wedding disagreement with Brandon's mom Betty. Like before, tensions flared out between the two due to their history of animosity. The intense drama between him and his wife has always dragged him in. Although he refrains from speaking much at the moment so as not to exacerbate the situation, he felt he had had enough. Betty was roundly scolded by Julia for interfering with her fertility appointments. She and Brandon picked up her parents from the airport as soon as they landed in the United States. During his journey, Betty contacted her son to discuss her parents. After Julia listened, her mother-in-law broke the news to her husband that she and her husband's mom aren't getting along. According to her, a major argument ensued after their last chat. Brandon and Julia's heartwarming update on their personal lives has fans stunned and captivated. Using stunning prenatal images, the couple announced their pregnancy on Instagram. The couple is finally expecting their first child after enduring immense mental, emotional, and physical challenges. The diagnosis of a polyp in her uterus sent chills down her spine. In spite of their long-term relationship, Julia and Brandon were unable to start a family. He longed for a child with her, but her Russian doctor's previous results let her down. The idea of being a mother never occurred to her. Her in-laws and spouse put a lot of pressure on the reality star to have a family. They had a pet llama, and she showed off her growing baby bump while posing with him and Nala. In the 10th episode of Season 9 of Happily Ever After, Brandon and Julia took a trip to Miami accompanied by both sets of parents. They were going to renew their vows in front of her parents so they could relive their wedding day. Betty voiced her opinion as she planned a wedding ceremony on the beach. When asked about Betty's idea, Julia shot it down, insisting that she wanted things done her way. She confessed on air that her mother-in-law had been a tyrant during her first wedding, as she saw her be pursued to have the ceremony all to herself. Her mother-in-law always did what she thought was proper and what made her happy. On the other hand, Julia has pledged to make sure it doesn't happen again because she is planning her parents' wedding on the beach and thinks they would adore it. The weather shouldn't dampen their spirits, she hoped. She best just shut up and leave Brandon alone if his mother comes up to the wedding, according to the TLC star. The fact that Betty had turned Julia's special day into an opportunity for herself led her to lash out at the cameras. Her dream wedding would have been a small, charming affair overlooking Miami Beach at sunset. When Brandon heard her, he promised to be by her side no matter what. Julia Trubkina is pregnant, expecting baby number 1 with 90-day fiancé husband Brandon Gibbs. Fans of the 90-day fiancé pair have been assured time and time again that the couple's decision to have children is final. So, they reached a consensus. They have a plethora of pictures of Julia's growing belly to prove that she is pregnant. Julia was not ready to be a farmhand many years ago, which is understandable. Her impending task is considerably more challenging. Big news from 90-day fiancé stars Julia Trubkina and Brandon Gibbs. They made their announcement on Tuesday, August 26th. Julia posted 2 images to Instagram, one of which was a yellow dress and the other a white one, both of which served to highlight her growing baby belly. There was a photo of her kissing her hubby. Several ultrasound pictures were in Brandon's hands. In her caption, Julia wrote, "I will begin with this because there is so much to say. This is completely out of character for me, and the topic is quite peculiar, but I must begin discussing it," she went on to say. Brandon, her husband, joined her in taking to social media to express his own joy. Photos of Brandon Gibbs and Julia Trubkina were uploaded on Gibbs's personal Instagram page. In both photos, her growing baby belly is front and center. It seems like they changed costumes and went to 2 separate places for their maternity shoot. "I still can't believe I'm telling you this," Brandon exclaimed. "I am eager and anxious at the same time because I want to do my best as a father." In honor of Julia's pregnancy, the official 90-day fiancé social media accounts also took part in the festivities. These weren't just season 8 highlights either. With 90-day fiancé, happily ever after, they made a triumphant return to the franchise. Season 6. Even though their appearance on the contentious spin-off 90 Day, The Last Resort seemed out of place to some viewers, the duo did make an appearance in Season 2. For some, it was enough to simply see them on TV again. It was terrible that Julia Trubkina had to stay with Ron and Betty Gibbs, Brandon's parents, when they reconnected in Virginia. The idea that the Gibbs family's almost paranormal conduct was staged for the cameras is appealing to us. All the warning signs were there: the separate bedrooms rule, the intrusiveness, and the terrible surprise party ambush. To cut a long tale short, people are making fun of Brandon for allegedly asking Mommy Dearest for permission to impregnate his wife. Some are being more serious, saying that the pair has to establish limits with Brandon's parents immediately. A lot of people worry that it's too late to establish limits with them because it's been a long time. No more today. What are you thinking about this gossip today? Let us know in the comments, and stay tuned by subscribing to our channel to get more updates like this. Thank you.